Hey guys, so this is part 2 of me reading Bad Dreams, the fan fiction that I read in the last video. This is a fantastic fan fiction, but warning, there's rape. Here's a recap of what happened last time. So pretty much, Phil has a boyfriend whose name is Jake, who has a specific kink. It's a voyeurism kink, I think that's what it is. And they go to a club to watch people have sex. They get into the club and Phil's really nervous and really anxious. Then the entertainment comes on stage. And the entertainment is this boy who's barely 18. He's really young. And Phil's like, why is there like a little boy on stage? Like, this isn't okay. This boy is Dan. We'll see what happens next.
The man in the suit tugged the tie to prompt the boy to take a few steps forward. They were standing in front of the bed now. Gentlemen, meet Dan. This is his debut. He's 18, a virgin, and is ready to be fucked. Who's interested? The men gathered around the stage and howled in response. Phil was going to look away again, but his eyes fell on the boy's face. He couldn't tell what color they were at this distance, but the boy's eyes were widened so much that he could see the whites of them. He was tall, but his shoulders were slumped like he wanted to make himself look so small that he could hide. He was also biting and chewing his bottom lip so hard that Phil expected to see blood soon. As soon as the crowd gave an initial shout to show their interest in Dan, various voices started to rise from the crowd. Have him take off his shirt! I want to see more of him! Patience, patience, said the man in the suit. Make him turn around! I want to see that ass! The man tugged the tie to bring the boy within his reach. While the boy's hands went to his throat to loosen what was apparently becoming a very tight knot across his windpipe, the man in the suit manhandled him. He grabbed Dan by the shoulder and turned him around so that his back was facing the crowd. Then he lifted up Dan's untucked shirt to expose his backside in the tight trousers. Satisfied? The man in the suit asked. When the crowd whooped in answer, the man slapped Dan's ass before releasing him. Any other questions? How do we know he's a virgin? A man shouted. A few others grumbled to their agreement in this. The boy had turned around to face the crowd again. At these words, his face flushed. He is, the man in the suit said. And trust me, you won't have a doubt when you feel how tight he is. So, any takers? He laughed when several men shouted their interest, each trying to be heard over the others. Okay, let's hear some numbers. Highest bidder gets the first shot. The others will just have to watch and wait their turn. Phil turned back to face the bar. As he picked up his drink, the ice had mostly melted in the cocktail by now. His hand shook slightly. This was not at all what he had pictured when he agreed to come here with his boyfriend. The boy on the stage looked scared, and Phil didn't want to see this. He looked up from his drink when he felt Jake's hand on his shoulder. Jake had also turned around to face the bar as the auction started behind them, and he gave Phil a broad smile. Well, how are you liking it so far? Liking it, Phil repeated as he organized his thoughts. I just feel bad for the kid. This is an awful way for him to lose his virginity. Jake snorted in response and shook his head. Phil, you're so naive. That's just a thing they say. It's all for show, all for the kinks. He's probably been screwed 100 times already. But they're just saying it to help get old men off. You'll see, it's all an act. He'll make a show of being all shy when it begins, but then he'll start moaning. If you say so, Phil mumbled, because the boy hadn't looked like he was acting. But the thought of it being all for show comforted Phil a bit. So he was happy that Jake said it. He took another sip of his drink, thinking that he might have to order another cocktail and drink it soon if he was going to get through this night. The bidding started to wind down, and finally the highest bid was accepted when there were no more challengers. Some of the men in the crowd grumbled in annoyance as they had missed out, while others were congratulating the highest bidder and offering suggestions of what he should do to the boy that he had just bought. Phil ordered his second drink and started nursing it, while at his side Jake was staring intently over his shoulder. Since there was no other sound but the soft murmur of the crowd, Phil wasn't sure what his boyfriend was seeing. As Phil started to feel buzzed, he heard something that made his spine stiffen. The creaking of bed springs. A hush fell over the room, and Phil could hear what was the pounding of his own heart, and there was a gasp, pained whimper that came from across the room. This didn't sound like what Jake said it was going to happen, but Jake started to breathe heavy. Phil glanced at him, seeing his boyfriend's unblinking gaze that was fixed upon what was happening across the room. His pupils were dilated with arousal. Jake seemed to sense Phil's eyes on him because he turned to face Phil with a smile. It's really hot. You should take a look. The man Oh, my cat's here. Hello. Having her here will make this reading a little bit easier. The man fucking Dan was now grunting in pleasure, and the sound made Phil grimace. The sound didn't sound like Phil something wanted to see. So he shook his head. Jake sighed. Why did you come here, Phil, if you're not even gonna look? Phil bit his lip, considering his words because he didn't want to get into an argument now. I'm here for you, because you wanted this. Okay, I want you too, Jake said, leaning in to place a kiss against the side of Phil's neck. Phil leaned into Jake when he kissed his neck because this was unexpected. In general, Jake wasn't an affectionate boyfriend. He kissed Phil when he wanted it to lead to sex, and he was sweet only when he wanted something special from Phil in the bedroom. When they had first started dating, Phil had wanted cuddles, kisses, soft touches, but he quickly gave up when Jake had called him clingy and pathetic. So his skin tingled under Jake's lips, starved for attention. He leaned into it as the lips lingered, sucking a mark into his skin. Jake's hands were giving him some attention too. They roamed over his hip and then up his shirt, one hand playing with the fabric of his boxer briefs while the other hand trailed up his chest. It felt nice until the boy in the room gave a very loud whimper. Phil stiffened under Jake's hands, but he didn't seem to notice. Jake repositioned himself on the stool so that he was closer to Phil and one of his thighs was behind him. Phil had also realized that Jake's head was turned so that he could continue watching the stage while sucking on Phil's neck. The whimpers were getting louder and the man fucking Dan seemed to be close, judging by the way he was groaning. Phil noticed it when what was happening on the stage finished because Jake gasped at the sight of whatever was happening, and the breath on his skin made Phil shiver. Jake jerked in his seat, his pelvis coming closer to grind against Phil's. For a moment, Phil was relieved. He thought that when the noises coming from the stage had stopped, it would be over. But he had forgotten that the man in the suit said that more men in the crowd would have their shot with the boy once it had finished. When Dan yelped in pain, Phil shut his eyes, though all he could see in front of him were bottles of liquor behind the bar. Jake's lips stopped sucking at his neck. God, I want to do that to you. Phil, you should really see this. Phil opened his eyes and shook his head. I don't understand this. You want to make me sound like that? Yes. I want to pin you beneath me and watch you submit to me. Phil shivered. The thought of it did not turn him on. It made him uneasy. He and Jake had talked about it and tried a few things with handcuffs, but he didn't think that he could give Jake what he wanted. The issue was that he didn't trust Jake in that way. As he heard the boy crying in pain behind them, he knew just how easily those cries would come from him if he submitted to Jake, who wouldn't stop as long as he could make himself feel good using Phil's body. He couldn't do this. He didn't want this. Phil shook his head and swallowed heavy. Jake, I don't like this stuff. I just want to go home. I feel sick. I like it though, Jake said, and the hand on his waist tightened until Phil was held in a bruising grip. You never do anything that I like. Why are we even here together if we never do anything that I like? Phil licked his lip. Usually he would have just accepted Jake's word, which were thinly veiled with the threat to leave Phil if he didn't do what he wanted. But right now, Phil was the only one who wanted to leave. The sounds coming from the bed were making him want to vomit. The cocktails churning unpleasantly in his stomach. He hated the fact that he felt like an accomplice to what was happening to the sacred boy because he was sitting in the room. He just wanted to run away. So he decided to argue with Jake for once. I know why we're together. Do you? We're together because we like each other and like spending time together, except I'm not really comfortable right now, so I'm with you because I love your body, Jake said as he continued to run his hands underneath Phil's shirt, leaving a tingling trail across skin. Didn't feel good. Phil, I want you to touch me. What? Phil gasped, vaguely noting that the boy on the stage was also gasping. Touch you where? Where do you think? Jake said with a snort. Rub me through my jeans, or better yet, in my jeans. Come on, Phil, I'm already so close. Close? From watching this? The only thing that this was doing to make Phil close was vomiting all over the bar top. From what was happening to the boy and the rising sensation that his boyfriend was more than a bit sick. As he shook his head, Phil said, No, I don't want to. Come on, I said I was close. Jake insisted, shifting nearer to Phil. You're my boyfriend, so you have to. Phil shook his head, but he took his hand out of Phil's shirt to place it on his wrist. He took Phil's hand and placed it in the bulge in his jeans, urging Phil to rub it. The grip on his wrist was unyielding, and he felt the bones of his wrist grinding together, so when he started to stroke Jake through his jeans. The grip on his wrist was unyielding, and he felt the bones of his wrist grinding together, so he started stroking Jake through his jeans. Phil hated this. He hated to feel so exposed, doing this in public where anyone could be watching. It wasn't the same, but he felt almost as if he was on display just as the poor boy on stage. Then the comparison became too much when Jake groaned with pleasure at the same time that the man who was currently fucking the boy. "I can't, let me go," Phil protested. He twisted his wrist in Jake's hand as the pressure brought his eyes to tears, but he managed to get free. "Phil," Jake said with an annoyed sigh. Phil met the green eyes that were narrowed with annoyance. Phil swallowed heavily because he didn't like what he saw in those eyes. Slowly, like he was a mouse that caught a cat's gaze, he climbed off the bar stool. "Where are you going?" Jake asked. His hand flew to the back of Phil's neck, stopping him from taking another step away. His hand started to squeeze and Phil gasped. He felt bile rising in the back of his throat, and it wasn't just from disgust this time. His voice shook with terror as he said, "Let me go, Jake. I'm sick. I don't want to be sick here." When Jake released him, Phil hurried to scurry out of the room. But not before glancing at the stage, since he once more feeling that sense of morbid curiosity. The boy was on his knees, facing the crowd with a man behind him. He looked exhausted. That was all Phil noticed before the boy's eyes were fixed on him. They locked gazes for a moment before Phil fled the room, wanting to get to the bathroom before Jake grabbed him again. Once Phil was in the bathroom, Phil ran into his stall and locked the door behind him. He took a deep breath. It was quiet here except for the sound of a dripping tap. He felt safe and the urge to vomit had left him. So he leaned against the door of the stall and tried to take deep breaths until his hands had stopped shaking. Phil swallowed heavily, reminding himself that there was a locked door and a bathroom stall between them. He said, "I think I'm gonna stay in here for a little while. I don't feel so good." "You sound fine to me. Come on, Phil. I'm missing the finale of the show because of you." Phil shook his head, though Jake shouldn't see him. "I'm not coming. You go watch." Jake sighed heavily. "Phil, I'm not happy about this. You spoiled the night for me. If you don't come out here right now, I'm gonna drive off and leave you here." For a long moment, Phil just stood there, listening carefully while his heart pounded in his chest. Finally, Phil heard the retreating footsteps and the bathroom door opened and closed. He peeked through the gap of the door of the stall and saw the room was empty, so he sagged against the cool metal surface with relief. He didn't trust Jake to not be standing outside the bathroom door while he would grab him in a moment when he left the room, so he stayed where he was focusing on just his breathing. Some time had passed before the bathroom door opened again. It was a public bathroom, so Phil wasn't too concerned with the other person in the room until he heard how labored the other man's breathing was. Though he turned on the sink, Phil couldn't mistake the sound of soft sobbing over the rush of the water. Phil peeked through the small gap in the stall door again, and this time he saw who was in the room. It was the boy from the stage. As Phil watched, the boy's shaking legs gave out and he slowly lowered himself to the floor while keeping a shaky grasp on the edge of the sink. The boy settled onto his knees with a whine and pressed his forehead against the edge of the porcelain sink. It was too much. Phil had witnessed this boy's pain for the entire night and he couldn't spectate anymore. Quietly, he unlocked the stall door and approached the boy. "Hi there. You're Dan, right?" The boy spun around with a gasp. One of his hands continued to grip the sink, but the other went to his stomach as the abrupt movement apparently made something hurt. He was staring up at Phil with wide eyes that Phil could now see were a rich shade of brown. Phil could tell that he was scaring him by towering over him, so he held out his hands to show that he wasn't going to hit him. Slowly, he moved beside him until he was kneeling next to him. The sink between them continued pooling with water, with streaming water. The boy relaxed when Phil knelt. He seemed too exhausted to hold himself stiff with the terror for too long. He nodded before once more pressing his forehead against the porcelain sink. "Yeah, I'm Dan. I know you. You were at the bar." Phil cringed. "I'm sorry." He hated the fact that he had just been grouped in with the other 24 men that had came here to see Dan's pain. As much as he wanted to explain to himself and his presence here tonight, none of that was important right now. The boy was really hurt. Do you want me to take you to a hospital?" Dan shook his head and shut his eyes. "No, I'm fine." He didn't look fine. The white button-down shirt was mostly open, and where it was unbuttoned, Phil could see red marks and bruises forming on the boy's skin. He trembled, and though he had stopped crying, his cheeks were blotchy. Phil stood up and grabbed the paper towel from a nearby dispenser. He dampened a corner of it to the warm water before turning it off. Then he returned to the boy's side. Dan was staring at him with wide eyes. When Phil held the paper towel before his face, Dan cringed away. Phil bit his lip and pulled back. "I'm sorry. I know you have no reason to trust me after seeing me in that room tonight, but I swear I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just trying to help." "I know that," Dan said softly. "I do. I don't think you're going to hurt me." "Oh?" Phil asked. He decided to try touching Dan's face again, and this time Dan didn't flinch. Dan wiped the drying tears from the boy's blotchy face, noticing how soft and smooth the skin was. Dan nodded. I don't think you're the type of person who hurts people. Actually, that guy you were here with tonight, I saw him grab your neck. Phil looked at Dan with wide eyes. You did? It seemed remarkable to him that anybody could have noticed Phil's distress while going through what Dan had gone through at that moment, and this had been contrasted by the moments Phil had been suffering while in a relationship with Jake. Phil's family, his friends, and his neighbors had all seen him with Jake, and none of them had noticed. But this poor, injured boy had seen Phil once with Jake and had known it was wrong. It made Phil feel uneasy and exposed, though this oddly comforted him at the same time. The boy knew what that was. That was... I know what it was. Really, I know, Dan said, leaving no doubt that he saw his own situation mirrored in Phil's. He gave Phil a wobbly grin. Takes one to know one. Seriously, though, I was worried about you when he chased you. Did he catch you? Are you hurt? He didn't hurt me this time. I'm fine, Phil said. He was running the damp paper towel across Dan's forehead to clean him of sweat. I hid in the stall and locked the door. He said that he was leaving me here. I think he's gone. Oh, good. I'm glad you weren't hurt, too. He's having trouble keeping his eyes open, and he looks like he might trip over at any moment. The chocolate brown eyes opened fully when Phil put a hand on his shoulder. Hey, Dan, is there something I can do to help? Someone I can call, or someplace I can take you? Dan shook his head. I don't have anybody. I ran away from home recently, and I'm never going back. And I don't have anywhere to go. I've been staying here, but my boss said that he wanted to see me after the show, and I don't like the way that he looked at me when he said it. I can't handle what he wants to do to me right now. It hurts so much, and I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to leave. Phil gave the shoulder under his hand a soft squeeze. I'll help you leave. Let me know where you want me to take you.
And that is where we are leaving off. If you like this video so far, give it a thumbs up. I promise it'll start to get happier in the next video. Yeah, it's a really, really good fan fiction, and even though it's very triggering, it's great. It's fantastic. So, yeah, see you in the next video.